Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the LCI Green Room. I'm Jacob Winograd. I'm host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, which is part of our Christians for Liberty network. And you can, of course, find out more about us at christiansforliberty.net. I'm excited for tonight's live stream. First, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, just as a forewarning for this stream, I'm getting over a bit of a cold, and so my voice might be a little raspy, and you might see me while I'm not talking blowing my nose. So I apologize, but what can you do? The show must go on, as they say. There's no rest for the weary, and as I was talking to our guest before show, I'm trying to breed the next generation of libertarians. So, and on that note, if you want to support me and heck, if the show does really well, my wife and I will have more, right? So please like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. If you're listening to the audio later, 5-star reviews are always appreciated to help boost us in those algos. And then, of course, you can go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com if you want to support the show. Hit the donate link that you find there. I will also be, Monday is kind of the new live stream day for the most part, but occasionally we'll do 2 live streams a week, and this is one of those weeks. I'm going to have Stephen Nikela on Thursday night, I believe at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. He is the recently new chair of the Libertarian Party, and I'm going to have him on to just kind of, check in with the Libertarian Party. Our the Libertarian Party is a bit of a it's like the black sheep of the family of the liberty movement. But we still care about them. We're going to see what's going on there, and a lot of stuff going on. So that'll be a good conversation. As for tonight, I'm excited for tonight's guest. We're going to have a conversation about the big A word. And no, I don't mean an expletive. I mean something worse than an expletive, depending on your political leanings. We're talking about, of course, anarchy. And of course, anarchy is a word that gets thrown around and has different connotations and meanings to different people. Of course, for some, there's this expression, no gods, no masters, right? And it's sort of an implication of a rejection of all authority. For others, and this is the way I typically use it, it's more of a synonym for voluntarism or libertarianism, society built on consent and property rights, not on monopoly control. But of course, there's still many people that just equate the word to just chaos and destruction and just the collapse of society. And then, of course, if you are familiar with anarchism, libertarianism, the history of it, that there are different economic divides within the school of anarchism. So, what does all this mean, right? What do we think about these different economic strains of anarchism? What do we think about these different slogans and the role that things like faith and fiction and culture play when it comes to resisting the tyranny of the state? And are these things that can be, tools to obtaining freedom, or are they distractions? Well, tonight I'm joined by Derek Willis, who is known on social media as at AncapAir, to talk about a lot of this stuff and whatever else comes up. But it's the theme of how we can best resist empire without compromising our principles. So with that said, I'm going to bring our guest up now. Derek, thanks for joining the show, buddy. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, man. I appreciate you inviting me. This is it kind of came at a perfect time with the new essay coming out. It was kind of, we had this set up beforehand, but I'm really glad at the timing at everything because honestly, it's something that's important to me. I think that unity is a good thing. So I've been getting a lot of grief, but I'm excited for what this show's going to have. Surely going to have a lot of great sound bites coming out of it for sure.
Yeah, of course. You the unity is something that's been talked about in many different contexts in the liberty movement, and I'm definitely excited to talk to you a little bit about that. Yeah, and that wasn't planned. It just happened. You sent me your newly published article, I think yesterday. I
Yep.
got a chance to read it, and so it was like, well, hey, this is a spontaneous order, right? We didn't centrally plan this, so we're already demonstrating that freedom is superior. But before we dive into the conversation, Derek, can you just go ahead, and this is your first time on my show. We've talked a lot back and forth on social media and private chats, but my audience might be pretty new to you. So could you go
Yeah.
ahead and just introduce yourself, your background? You can go ahead and give your 30-second or 60-second how I became a libertarian story.
Yeah.
Bring status
So
story.
yeah. So my background, I've always been very passionate about individual liberty. But I didn't exactly always know what that meant. I was raised in a very Republican household, and I supported the Constitution and the whole founding fathers vision. And I was a big gun rights guy. And then, I went and joined the military because there's nothing better that you could do with your life than to serve your country. Um, and That's what kind of started my disillusionment with the current setup of things. Although it took me much later to actually become where I am now. I started leaning more libertarian after the military. I got out, and I voted libertarian for the first time in 2016, and I started writing my first book in 2017, which at the time was going to be kind of like a minarchist manifesto, if anything. And Then I discovered Murray Rothbard. The first thing I ever read of his was For a New Liberty, and it changed my life. And I had to rewrite about half of the book that I had already written. And Yeah, that's ultimately kind of what sealed it for me. And since then, it's just been a never-ending journey of seeking knowledge. I'm still very stout in my anarcho-capitalist ways, my voluntarist ways, if you want to call it that. But I've since expanded into more, and even some of the things that I wrote in my first book, I no longer adhere to, particularly as it comes to other schools of thought. Whenever it comes to anarchy, so that's kind of my evolution, and where I came from and where I'm at now. So
Right on. No, there's so many stories of people who are ex-military, and it's like no one can really disillusion you to the problems of the military and the American empire than people who were ex-military and seen it up close.
yeah,
In my experience, talking to many people from the liberty movement who have a similar backstory as you. So we opened by talking about this article you wrote, which I'm just going to present it just briefly here on the screen so people can see it. We're not going to read through the whole article here right now, but just so people can get a sense for it. This is on the validity of anarcho communism. And we'll
yeah,
just read a little intro here. There's a very strong belief among individuals within the liberty movement that causes unnecessary division in what could be a very powerful force against statism, the rift between anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-communists and all other forms of anarchism. Needs to be mended, not because we must agree on every detail of a post-state society, or any details for that matter, but because our shared enemy demands total focus and unity among its dissenters. So it's a pretty, strong opening statement there. I'll admit I'm one of the readers who's reading this, and I think I have maybe more of an open mind than most, but I do have some trepidations when approaching the subject. I'm a little bit more inclined to be, to use the Christian term as ecumenical. I'm pretty ecumenical with mutualists and with minarchists, even constitutionalists. Um, or like those who prefer the term market anarchists, who are, I think sometimes not that far from ANCAPs, but just don't like the term
right.
capitalism. Anarcho-communists, though, is that is I think the harder one to try to, at least in my experience, to find some reconciliation with. Not because I agree, I think, with the premise you bring up in the article, which is that it's true in somewhat of a theory, but I do think that there are some potential risks. But why don't you go ahead and just, in your own words, summarize your argument in this article for why what do you mean by the validity of anarcho-communism, and what are common misconceptions that you think people have about it, that is making it harder for them to perhaps be more willing to consider them, brothers in arms against the state.
Right. And I want to make something very clear from the get go. I don't think that, and I say this throughout the essay, I don't think that ANCAPs and ANCOMs can coexist in the same society, but they can coexist in the same world, even as neighboring societies. So, you're not going to have Ancompton and Ancapistan together in one centralized location. It might be something more akin to neighboring cities or neighboring towns. And there are some obviously very fundamental differences in the two ideologies. And the biggest point of contention has to do with the view of property. And I think a lot of this stems from the ANCAP and ANCOM having two different definitions for what constitutes private property. We hear, on the more economic right, hear the term private property. We think everything: our house, our computers, our phones, our clothes, our guns, any real estate ventures that we have, business ventures, that's all encompassing as private property. But ANCOMs don't view it like that. Most of what I mentioned, they are perfectly okay with people having. They call it personal property. Your house, your clothes, your firearms, all the little things that most people own is, what they call personal property. What they call private property specifically relates to the means of production. And obviously, this is a point of contention that we will never agree on. And I'm not suggesting that we should sacrifice our tenets and our core beliefs on what we believe property is and what, anything like that. But it isn't important to distinct what we mean. We're talking two different languages whenever we have these arguments on social media, and that only perpetuates the problem. So if we could get an understanding of what the other language is, maybe we can have a bit easier time communicating. And ultimately, the thesis here is that despite all these differences, we have a lot in common. Namely, we have this big, powerful enemy known as the state and statism that enslaves us all in one way or another, that taxes, regulates, steals from us, does all of these evil things to us. It doesn't matter what our ideology is. ANCOMs don't get a pass on their tax bill because they're ANCOMs. They still get the same tax bill, and if they don't pay it, the same punishment will be dealt to them from the state. It's evil. It doesn't matter who it's being brought against. And I think that if we recognize the commonalities that we have, even outside of just the state, there are other commonalities that we do share, such as voluntary association, dissociation, etc. I think we'd find out that if we actually weighed what we agreed and disagreed on, we'd find out that we have a lot more in agreement than disagreement. And I know the property thing is severe. It probably should be weighted more. But that's why I say we can coexist in the same world, just not the same society. We can be, neighbors in neighboring towns, but we just can't be, within the same boundaries, and that's fine. We can coexist that way. There's no problem with that. And I encourage anybody who is against the state and against statism to unify together in our fight against statism, in our messaging to anyone and everyone who doesn't know how to live or imagine a world without the state's boot on their throat.
No, I think that's, those are well-stated arguments. I tend to agree insofar as I think that, put it this way, if you were wrong, it would be actually very detrimental to the argument for the practicability and survivability of a free society. Because if you don't suppose that you can have, and I know some people don't like this term because I guess David Friedman came up with it, and he's more of a consequentialist libertarian, but I think it's an accurate description of a free society, that it's a polycentric legal order, right? It's not there's not one monopoly of power, right? And that means that the ways that different communities are going to organize and the I guess like laws or like market norms and whatnot that they operate under are going to be different. And if you don't suppose that you can have not this sort of like silly statist like utopian harmony, right? Because problems exist, and we as anarchists don't presuppose that anarchy solves all the world's problems, right? We reject, I call it the nirvana fallacy, comparing liberty against this like, weird idealized central planner that gets everything right, even though it doesn't get anything right in the current status quo. Um, but yeah, it's like, so if we can't find a way to, again, mostly uh, peacefully coexist on the same planet, even within relative, maybe not in the exact same, as you pointed out, towns and cities, but within relative, proximity of each other, we can't peacefully coexist. That would seem to me to be an argument against the validity of an anarchist or voluntarist, society and world in the first place. So,
Right.
insofar as I do think, and you'd probably agree, there are concerns about that property distinction, though, because, and to be fair, there are certainly instances where ANCAPs can fall into the trap of thinking they need to use the state, but with the ANCAP one, it can seem more pernicious because their foundation is built upon the idea that the private ownership of the means of production is somewhat inherently uh, tyrannical, right? So,
Right.
but so yeah, I mean, but I think overall, I think your point is well taken. That and put it this way, um, I probably not just probably, I know this from experience that there are many times where I've interacted with ANCOMs, on social media and whatnot, and in terms of our opposition to different state laws and programs, we're usually fairly aligned, even if there are some fundamental differences in our worldview.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you know, in writing this essay, I corroborated with a couple of anarchists who are more left leaning, um, and I wanted to make sure that what I was saying and what my understanding of their philosophies were was accurate. And I also, I was given some really good guidance by Jeremiah Harding, who,
And I love Jeremiah, by the way. He's been on the show several times.
yeah, honestly, he's amazing. He's incredibly sharp, and he gave me some really great advice. He goes, "Look, you quote Rothbard in here, and you bring up Hoppe. You don't bring in any anarcho-communist theorists who have any quotes from them." And so I think it would give you a lot more credibility if you research that. And so I did.
Yeah.
And it's amazing whenever I find like prominent anarcho-communists, like there's no like there they are absolutely anarcho-communists. There's no distinction. Krompkin and Alex Bregman. And reading some of what they wrote, I mean, there are some things that I obviously don't agree with. There are things that Rothbard's written that I don't agree with.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
but there's also a lot that I was agreeing with, which is why I picked some of these quotes, like defining what anarchism is. And I'm not going to read this whole quote because I make a whole a long one. But Alexander Berkman says in 1929, his essay "What is Communist Anarchism?" He says, "Anarchism means that you should be free, that no one should enslave you, boss you, rob you, or impose on you. It means that you should be free to do the things you want to do, and then in that you should not be compelled to do what you don't want to do." I mean, find me an ANCAP who disagrees with that. Because, I mean, that's literally how we define anarchy, even on our economic right. It's voluntary association and disassociation. The only real difference that we have is kind of, and people might weight this a little bit more, but our value system. ANCOMs value the collective good over their own individual good, whereas we value our own individual good over the collective good. And there's nothing wrong with either of those. If you selflessly work to help others, and that's your mission in life, and you feel really altruistic, that you are put on this planet to serve others. There's nothing wrong with that if you're doing that voluntarily. Obviously, if there's a gun to your head, that's a lot different. But there's nothing wrong with that value system. Just like there's nothing wrong with thinking, I want to better myself. I want to go out and start ventures. I want to invent things. I want to hone my skills to be the best individual I can be. There's nothing wrong with that either. And so it's really just a matter of values. What do you value more? And it's kind of a free market idea, right?
Yeah.
If you value collectivism more than individualism, then go be with collectivists who value it that same way. And
Oh
there's
yeah.
nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that.
No, I agree, and I also agree with just the point that like we should be trying to pull from more than one source. I talk about this a lot. One of the things that I detest about the modern libertarian like social media ethos, at least, is the propensity to block those on social media who disagree with you. Listen, I have, things that I've said or done that I'm sure even you would disagree with, and there are people who I agree with that you've disagreed with, but the difference is that I'm someone who always believes that I want to hear from those who disagree with me because I actually so and I'll bring him up more than once in this episode, and and this is a good example of this too. Even beyond anarchists, we can get true insights, valuable wisdom from people who don't 100% fit our worldview. Right? There are things that I pull from Jordan Peterson, despite the fact that he's shaky on a lot of things. But one of his rules was when you're in a conversation to converse with someone as if they know something you do not. I think it's a
Hmm.
very important way to go about life is to not pretend that you have it all figured out and that, to presuppose that just because someone, doesn't, fit all my, ideological boxes, that means that they don't have some valuable insight. Sometimes opposing or at least, slightly dissenting worldviews can, even if you think they get something wrong, if you look at what they're like reacting to or what they're trying to wrestle with, you realize that like there's something there that's valuable. Like for me, studying early anarchists like Proudhon and understanding why they viewed property as theft and why they viewed rent as theft, I think they kind of got that wrong. But there is something true to what they were criticizing, which is the propensity for which, in state capitalism does create this sort of rent-seeking behavior, which is not something that we as ANCAPs should defend and say that this is the way free markets would work without the state. This is a bug of the state. So yeah, maybe the mutualists you know didn't quite parse that problem outright, but they identified a real problem which we still see in the world today. So yeah, I think there's value in there's value in conversation. And not, I mean,
Yes.
if libertarianism and anarchism is often boiled down to like we have two options in life when there's conflict: conversation or violence. And we as anarchists, we think that it is always preferable to do conversation over violence, and that violence is only justified if someone else has initiated it first. So it's like, how can we embody that? Like, how can we be good representatives to the world for our philosophy if what we're showing to the world is actually like we're saying that we can have a world built on mutual cooperation and rejecting violence and coercion where people solve their problems without that, but internally as a movement we just like we're so vicious to each other and we shut down dissent and we block. And I get, yeah, listen, freedom of association's a thing, but like that doesn't mean that you're beyond criticism if the way you choose to exercise that is to basically be like, I only want to hear from people who affirm my
Yeah.
everything that I already believe.
Yeah. And no, people will never grow if they don't open their minds. They don't have to like what they hear. They don't have to agree with what they hear. But if you close your mind and are just rejecting any new information, then you're not growing. You're not improving yourself. And honestly, I don't care what your philosophy is. If you have a philosopher that you idolize to the point where you cannot find a single flaw in their philosophy, you're not digging hard enough. You're not seeking to understand well enough. And if you can't find a philosopher that you disagree with on almost everything and find a little nugget that you do agree with, you're not looking hard enough. You're not trying to
Right.
grow. And, philosophy is this crazy catechism of ideas. That's all it is. And some might be objectively wrong, but others there's a lot of nuance there.
Yeah.
Philosophy in and of itself is basically all nuance, really, if you get down to it. And so there's, you know, I don't see why we need to hate each other for a difference in philosophy.
Yeah. No, I agree. Something that is related to this to slightly shift topics, but I've struggled with uh living in America, how I identify and relate to fellow Americans, and just like the different levels of, I guess, like the American, mythos, because and this kind of touches on the being able to learn from something I disagree with. So I came from the political left, even though I was raised in a conservative evangelical Republican household. I kind of became a leftist because I was raised in, you know, a neocon environment where I was told freedom meant bombing brown people halfway across the world. So I, of course, said screw that, and hadn't, didn't understand free markets and all that. So I won't do my whole origin story here, but then I became a libertarian, understood Austrian economics and capitalism and free markets, and but I something I think is a holdover from my lefty days, although I think there's a Christian component to it too, as far as I identify as a Christian. And I think that means I have loyalty to Christ and his kingdom, which is not of this world. And that means that I have great trepidation just from my faith in having too much allegiance or loyalty or reverence for worldly things, including nations, and this concept of America, which I saw this get weaponized so much as a kid. I remember in elementary school seeing a fellow student of mine who was an atheist, and her parents would not allow her to do the Pledge of Allegiance, and everyone just like mocked her and made fun of her for it, belittled her, like, what's wrong with you? Why don't why don't you get up and do this like weird repetitious thing that we're all doing, like we're Borg or something, right? And that really stuck with me as a kid, right? Like I didn't quite know what I was witnessing at the time, but I knew I was like, that's weird. Like, why are we all ganging up on her just because like she doesn't get up and pledge her allegiance to this flag, this little piece of cloth? Like, what does that even mean? I was only in like second grade, so I couldn't quite think about the ideas at a high level yet. But as I matured and started to like learn more about uh history and current events, and have like the American exceptionalist myth kind of fall apart in my head, uh that kind of latched on to my Christian convictions. But even as a libertarian, I struggle with this because I'm rambling a bit, but I'll kind of land it here. There's obviously elements of the American founding and like the Declaration of Independence and certain writings from not just the founding fathers, but those who were like pre-revolution, like Thomas Paine and whatnot, that like you can like read those and go like, wow, this is like, this is stuff that's part of the same stream that I get my political philosophy from. But there's also a lot of stuff, not just the Constitution and Spooner and all that, but just in the development of this sort of American mythology, that then like it gets really hard to do that separation of the baby and the bathwater with people, where like on one hand, I don't want people to think that like I'm some radical leftist who just hates America and gets pleasure out of burning flags. I don't care about burning flags, but I don't like sit there and like like burn flags in my backyard for fun either, right? But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, even the burning flag thing, it's like, why do to my conservative friends and family, I'll be like, why do you get so triggered when someone does that? Like, why does that invoke in you this like, we should deport this person because they hate America? And I'm just like, what crime have they committed? Like, why are you so attached to this? Like, and if America's going to stand for something, like, shouldn't it be freedom? And shouldn't it include freedom to burn a flag? Anyway, what are your thoughts on all? That's a lot there, but that's something I have consistently struggled with as a, recovering lefty and statist.
Yeah, and honestly, Same from as a recovering, conservative, right? I probably would have been one of those as a child to kind of scrutinize somebody who was not refusing to stand for the pledge because I was indoctrinated at the time, right? Um, but my whole thing, I used to be so proud of being an American, being a Texan, being from Houston. Like all of these little things like helped like support my identity in a way. And then I just whenever I started becoming more and more anarchist, I realized that none of that matters. Like I don't even want to call myself a Texan anymore because it, it it's transcended into this thing where it's now if you say that you're proud to be a Texan, now you have this political leaning with it. If you say you're proud to be a Tennessean or a Californian, there's this now political stigma attached to it, and that's what people think. It's no longer I'm from this specific geographic region of the world that we call Texas. It is I'm a Texan, therefore I must stand with everything Texas does. And that's what people think. And a lot of people actually believe that. Like even Texans will say, yeah, Texas, go Texas. Although Dan Patrick did this thing, I don't like that. But other than that, yay, Texas, our history is amazing. But I don't care for it anymore. And honestly, nobody should care for it. Your identity should be you as an individual. Um, your identity should be who you what makes you proud, and what makes you proud should be your things you do, some of the things that you believe, your actions. It shouldn't be where you're from, where you were born. All of these are accidents by happenstance. You just happen to be born in this location. You happen to be raised in this location. None of those things should be a source of pride, in my opinion. I'm not gonna judge anybody if it is, but that's just kind of how I feel about it. I don't like I don't like calling myself an American anymore. I don't like calling myself a Texan. I don't like calling myself a Houstonian. I don't live in Houston anymore, and now I live in Dallas Fort Worth. But even still, um, I just want to be me. I'm proud to be Derek, and I feel like that's how everybody else should be. But I won't force that.
Do you think that a problem, because like insofar as if to be a Texan or to be an American, I'm playing like a little bit of a, for lack of a better term, devil's advocate here. Uh, if those were not tied to, or sorry, let me put it a different way. If those didn't come with like some kind of obligation where people like invoke those to like get compliance out of you or conformity, but instead we're just like cultural things where like people said like hey, there's a history here, there are some moral lessons both from maybe the good parts of the history and the bad parts of the history, and in the same way that people can identify with stories and stuff, right? Like if that's all it amounted to, do you think that would make it easier to, even then, like I kind of agree with your framing, like I would never like I I never want to like identify like I'm an American or I'm a Texan, right? Like I kind of get like I have a hard time putting myself there, other than like just colloquially to be like, this is where I'm from. But I understand it has all this baggage with it. But I don't know. I guess I just wonder if we were able to remove that other baggage and just have, and if it was just culture, right? Because I
Yeah.
can imagine in a fully ANCAP, or anarchist society, like I don't know that the idea of nations would necessarily go away. Maybe it'd be called something different. Maybe you
Mm.
wouldn't have like everyone in entire continental land masses identifying as the same thing. It'd probably be more granular, like maybe Texan, maybe Pennsylvanian, or just Houstonian. Like that might be I can imagine that would still be a thing. People might still like. I
Yeah.
think culture is still an organic thing, but there probably wouldn't be a tendency to like uh add this a special especially tribalistic and like very like collectivist, like like you're part of this, so therefore there are certain strings attached
Yeah.
and obligations put upon you because of it.
No, honestly, I agree with you 1,000%. I actually have an essay entitled "Patriotism is Collectivist BS," and it goes into the history of the word patriotism. And before the American Revolution, patriotism, or patriot rather, was defined as you as you explained it, somebody who is proud of the land from which they come, their culture, the area, the geographic area. Like, that was it. It had nothing to do with your government. It had nothing to do with your country in that type of sense of nation state. It had to do with, it uses the word country in the definition, but if you look up using that same dictionary what country meant, it literally was just the geographic area. It had nothing to do with government. It wasn't until post-revolution and the publication of Merriam-Webster's dictionary that patriotism and the word patriot uh, actually took on this nationalistic definition, and it says it in there that you're proud of where you come from, and the history as well as the government. Like, it's ingrained in that definition. And I think that without the state, without any sort of like nationalism, anything like that, there would be nothing wrong with having that as part of your identity, because you're talking about your culture. And yeah, there's a little bit more collectivism in there, but it's it's a lot more nuanced. Again, bringing up this idea of nuance, it's a lot more localized. It's not this big, multi-million square mile region of area. It is the size of a town. And that's the thing. I firmly believe that if the anarchy were to take over the entire world, you wouldn't have just one anarchist society that covers the whole world.
Right.
Every single anarchist society, doesn't matter if they're anarcho-communist, anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-syndicalists, whatever, they would all have they would be cities and towns and villages, and that would be the, where you would say that you were from and how you identified, culturally. And you would have these microcultures and histories that you could be proud of in that sense. And not in a way that would be like, oh, this is my identity, but as a way of showing at least pure heritage, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. It's so hard because it's actually really hard to find a way to separate, again, the baby from the bathwater in terms of like culture and identity, right? Because I think that's the issue people struggle with, is that they have a hard time, um, I think, not falling into that trap where the culture and nation they are born into becomes their identity, at least for a certain amount of people. And then for other people, like on the left, it was never an issue necessarily. Like, people didn't really like identify as American, but then they would throw the baby out with the bathwater, where they're like, and everything about America's founding and all the ideas are absolute garbage and trash, and it's actually, we're just, it's founded on white supremacy and all this. And it's just like, okay, so it goes too far the other direction, where, and that's tough, because although yeah, there are certainly things to criticize, but like, I don't know. I guess I'm a fan of, uh, I never want to be the person who's like, every generation of people before me was evil, right? To
Right.
be fair, there is definitely, I think, a progression of sorts, right? Like, I do think we have progressed as a society in certain areas, um, but you can believe that, I think, and simultaneously believe that, like, at every point in human history, and maybe there's peaks and valleys along the way, but every point in human history, I think that there have been people who are good and decent, and it's the good and decent people of each of those eras that kind of like help to push the needle, right? Like, even you and me, we're helping to push the needle. And probably in 100 years, people will look back at us and be like, "Oh yeah, they were doing their best, right?" But there's a couple things they missed, right? I mean, we can sometimes, I think, even now, we'll think, now in the 21st century, we're evolved, and I'm sure in 100 years, people won't look back at us and have any judgments to make about certain things that we did or believed or practiced or anything like that. I at least don't want to presume that, right? I think it's a uh, tad bit egotistical.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so I titled this live stream America First or Anarchy First, right? And that's not just a conversation about the history, but recently in the past year, a lot of libertarians, including those who claim to be ANCAPs, and I'm not throwing them under the bus. I was to some extent part of this. Thought that there was fertile ground to be made in a sort of coalition with people on, I want to say, the right. Even that seems to be a bit inaccurate because the whole political landscape right now is a mess. I mean, like,
Yeah.
2 years ago, if you had told me RFK Jr. would be part of a Trump coalition, I would have been scratching my head and thinking you'd smoked something. But that's what happened. And so there's this weird, like, I guess, like, what combines it is it's the MAGA and MAHA, which is kind of all wrapped up in this American first mantra, right? And
Right.
there are things about that which, even from what we just talked about, where I'd go like, okay, that's not exactly like my preferred cup of tea, but the way it was pitched, I thought had some merit. Where I'm sitting now, I'm reevaluating. But the idea was like, before we can even think about anarchy or a voluntarist society or something that goes beyond the Constitution, like, we have a choice between a global, American hegemon, an empire that's growing, kind of like globalistic, not like globalism like free trade, but like globalistic, like, international UN, uh, the World Economic Forum, all this stuff controlling everything, or, you know, it's an imperfect first step, but maybe we have to become just a nation again, a republic, right? And you could call that isolationist if you will. And so I often struggle with this because although I think as radical as they come in my anarchist convictions, I am often like a little bit worried that we as anarchists can become detached from reality in the way where I feel like we are so, and this is it's a feature and a bug in my mind, because I think we're so committed to nonviolence, like in terms of like not pacifism, but like the non-initiation of force, right? That, and we live in such a statist society that it is kind of true that there's almost no path forward in trying to, like, move towards a freer society that isn't going to be mired in a bunch of state distortions and state aggression that we don't like. The analogy I've often used is like, it's kind of like, and I think it's a kind of a clumsy analogy, and I wish I had a better one. But it's like we're in New Hampshire and we're trying to drive to Las Vegas. And the problem is there is no straight road that gets us from point A to point B. And in fact, like, there's mountains in the way and rivers we have to cross, and we're mapping the route, and there's not a clear route. And the routes we're looking at, it's like, well, this route starts in the right direction, but then it loops around, and then we're going in the wrong direction for a while. And so that's what my worry is that on one hand, just to be clear, since my decision to kind of like, let me go with this vote for Trump strategy and see how that plays out. Since then, I've been like, okay, that's a disaster. Not not happy with that, and everyone gets to kind of dump on Jacob now for the next however long it takes to be like, told you so. And I basically told people, you get to gloat for a while, it's fine. I rolled the dice. I thought for once in my lifetime that maybe the lesser evil would be lesser enough to make a difference, and so far, I mean, I'm glad Ross is free, but that's kind of the only thing I can hang my hat on, is that Ross is free. um it's not been good. So I hear that, that didn't work out. But I don't know. What do you think about like my sort of struggle and dilemma with like, wondering, you know, are we just kind of waiting for a collapse and hoping spontaneous order rises from the ashes, or is there a sort of gradualism that could work out, that doesn't conflict with our principles in a way that goes too far? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. We've like talked a little bit about this online, but not in this kind of medium. So I'm hoping we can kind of
Yeah.
dive in a little bit deeper on it.
That's the $64,000 question, my friend. Um, God, if I had the answer to that question,
Right.
I like we'd already be down that path, right? And I just don't know. Like, I would love to see a group of anarchists, take over, and when I say take over, I mean politically, take over a town and then secede
We're gonna take over
and
the
set
world and
up,
leave you alone.
yeah, and then set them up, set this town up as, some anarchist society, whatever. But I genuinely fear that doing so will cause Waco 2.0. I would love to avoid a global catastrophe, a global economic collapse that turns the world into fallout. Uh, but I think that might be the easiest way to do this. I wish that there was an easy answer. I wish there, and I
Yeah.
wish I had the answer. I don't. I mean, maybe the answer is continuing, voting for libertarians or Republicans or whoever. Maybe that is it, and I'm just dumb and I don't get it, and we haven't had the right candidates, and maybe if we elect Justin Amash for president, or Thomas Massey will get it done, or maybe we can amend the Constitution and have Javier Milei come over and do that. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But I know the answer is not. I know what it's not. I know the answer is not continuing the collective mindset that we the people can fix it in that type of way. Because we're prioritizing the wrong things. Trump says America first. That resonates with a lot of people, and a lot of people like it. I loved the title of this episode, Anarchy First. But what's another word for anarchy? And it's liberty. Why not try liberty first? I mean, liberty has been the answer for forever. That's how we should. That's the messaging that we need to come across. That we need to put out there is that this is what liberty looks like to us. Other forms of liberty can exist. Whatever your particular flavor of liberty, that's fine. But the current setup of statism is not it because of X, Y, and Z reasons. I'm trying to do my thing with writing essays and books, to get the message of liberty out. I know, you got this podcast. Others have podcasts. I know people like Spike Cohen are doing great things with
You are the
actually,
power.
actually fighting statist atrocities.
Yep.
That's all great work. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I don't know either. And here's one thing. So I agree with you that things like "You Are the Power" I think are really cool. I'd like to see more of that. Like, just cut out the middleman of like political parties and just do direct action of just like, like if I was going to, people ask me, because I'll tell people about Spike Cohen and "You Are the Power," like, what is it? I was like, well, the way I want to describe it, which is an oversimplification, is cyberbullying the government until they leave people alone, which is actually not that bad of a description of what it is, and it works, right? Like, I mean, which is quite phenomenal. Maybe we need more of that. I don't know. But here's one thing that I think we need, right? Because it's like I I think education is important. I think what you do with essays and books, we need that, right? I do podcasts, I write articles, I'm working on a couple books. LCI's published books like this one right here, Faith Seeking Freedom, which is Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. And we're working on more, like I said. So, like, that's all, of course, really important. Um, I do think some people have a particular, like, inward calling and maybe even skill set to, like, dive into the muck of politics and try to, like, you know does it make a huge difference? I don't know. Maybe in the long run it does. It's kind of hard to say, but here's what I think would help. I wish, and this is like a criticism that I think cuts in all directions, and it applies to me too, that we often get so caught up in, and this goes back to the echo chamber thing, where if people are doing something that, like, we don't think that's the right strategy, we often spend more energy attacking other libertarians who we think are doing the wrong strategy or don't agree with our strategy than we do just, like, doing our own thing, and to the other one saying, like, hey, I don't know if that's going to work out, but more power to you. I hope you succeed, right? And like, we can't centrally plan liberty. Like, that's kind of like the opposite of what liberty is, right? So, like, maybe that's all we can do is just be like, you know what? We're all going to do our own thing, and we just hope that one day it's enough to, roll back or eliminate the state the whole way. And until then, like, let's try to, which is why I think that's the energy of your article is, like, let's stop making enemies where we don't need to, right?
Yeah. We have enough enemies. We have a big enough enemy
Yeah.
that, and honestly, we're outnumbered, like, significantly, and we need as much help as we can get, right? And I'm not saying that we have to agree on everything. Let's focus on messaging and bringing people to our side, even if it means bringing somebody into the liberty movement who's a communist, or bringing somebody, if you're an ANCOM, bringing somebody into the liberty movement that turns into an ANCAP.
I draw the line at Georgists, okay? No, I'm just kidding. Georgists are like the. Anyway, that's a whole tangent. I've had like I've had a lot of online debates with Georgists. It's kind of like I find their ideas even sometimes more annoying than ANCOM ideas, but that's like my prejudice I have to get over, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I agree with what you're saying. Another divide we see often in liberty movements is over, cultural divides and whatnot. And this can be tough for me as a Christian, because, like, I obviously, and I'm a very, like, I'm not a fundamentalist, but I am, like, a, very devout. Like, I believe the whole Bible is the inspired word of God, and I, attend my church every, more than once a week. Very involved in my local church and ministry and outreach and local missions and things like that. And so I'm very, as I said before, like, my ultimate allegiance is to Christ and His kingdom, which I think, that's the whole premise of what I do here, right? That, anarchism and being a Christian, I think, are, especially if you study the early church, I think, they're a lot more compatible than a lot of people realize at first. But that does tie into culture and beliefs, and there are a lot of libertarians and especially anarchists who scoff at the idea of religion, which I guess it's like they view God as a, like, well, you're submitting to God, and that's, it's a master, that's anti anarchy. And I go, like, listen, like, even if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in my religion, like, you're free not to believe in it. But, like, wouldn't you, just like what you're saying, like, why, like, I'm able to, so I used to do this show called Capitalist Communion. It was me and another Christian libertarian with two atheist libertarians. And we would just talk, like, once a month, and just, like, and we would even, like, debate religion and stuff, but we would just, like, show that, like, hey, like, we can all believe in freedom and liberty and not agree on religion, and, like, that's fine, right? Like, because at the end of the day, it's the same thing with the ANCOM stuff. I'm like, like, I find a lot of value in my atheist and agnostic, and even my, Muslim and Jewish and whatever other religion you have libertarian and anarchist friends, because your freedom to follow your religion or non-religion is the same as my freedom to follow my religion. So again, it goes to the whole thing, like this whole idea of freedom can't work if we can't normalize conversation over conflict.
Yeah.
But it does seem like for some people, religion is a bit more of a stumbling block for them than other things. And then to be fair, on the other side, there are some Christian libertarians who I have to scold because they start sounding like Christian nationalists because they're like, yeah, freedom for everyone except the gay people, and I'm like,
Yeah.
no, hold on.
It's not how liberty works.
That's not how liberty works at all. Like this whole like Glenn Greenwald stuff that's broken out lately has just been so annoying because I'm like, first of all, like, listen, you guys, like, this isn't news. Everyone knew Glenn was gay.
Yeah.
Like, and also like, can we not act like it's only gay people that sometimes have weird, freaky sex? Like, I know we're going a little bit PG-13 here today on the Libertarian
Uh-oh.
Christian show, guys, but I listen. Sometimes, listen, this is a harsh word for my Christian listeners. Like, sometimes we're way too fragile. Like we can sometimes be just like, like we'll make fun of the left for like being offended, but like, listen, sometimes Christians are the biggest snowflakes, right? Like someone can like be, someone could like share a Christian's entire political worldview, but then like they swear once. And then the Christians do this giant performative clutching pearls thing. And I'm just like, I don't know, like miss me with that. Like, I don't see where in the Bible that is, first of all, and second of all, like, could you be that outraged over people being killed and oppressed by the state as you are by people saying a no word?
Yeah. I mean, you would think that bombing of women and children and innocent men in another country just because of where they are should be appalling to somebody who proclaims the Christian faith. It doesn't matter who's doing the bombing or who the victims are. The bombing of innocent people is kind of counter to Christ's teachings, I believe. But you won't get that level of pearl clutching from a lot of people either. Probably because they don't see it.
Well, but even when you try to get them to see it, it's like, because now, I mean, like, I do as good a job as I can to present like the anti-war message from a Christian perspective. But like, I have an okay following, but I'm not like, Dave Smith or Scott Horton out there. But Dave Smith and Scott Horton are some of the biggest anti-war activists, but they're going to drop an F-bomb once in a while, or they'll say, God D word, right? And then people just like, well, now I can't listen to anything else they said because they cursed. I'm like, all right, like, never mind. First of all, they're talking about wars in which even Christians are being killed. It's like you'd think you'd even care, but that would be enough to make you care. But I don't know. It's just this weird performative thing, I guess, which is really, but again, it cuts both ways. Like today, because it's Pride Month, right? So I made a post and I said, I think Pride Month is kind of this like, I forget the exact way I put it. Let me pull it up here. Actually,
did you say that it was a psyop? I think I saw that post.
Yeah. I said to me, Pride Month is a psyop to here. I'm almost there. I'll just read it word for word. Pride Month is a psyop to make you complacent with tyranny by pandering to your group. I'd reject it even without my biblical view of marriage and sexuality. That said, the state should be separated from marriage entirely and not legislate behavior between consenting adults. And of course, then an atheist took issue with that and was just like, this person should never be trusted with power. And I was like, first of all, no one should be trusted with power. Second of all, like, you completely missed the part where I said the state shouldn't legislate the behavior. So what's the issue here? Like, why do you have to be so, like, I'm doing my best to say, listen, I don't agree with this whole Pride Month thing, but you do you, right? That's the beauty of freedom. But there are people on both sides who are just like, no, you got to believe like me, and then we can have freedom. And I'm just, it's annoying.
You know what's funny is that I know Pride Month has been kind of like bastardized by the state. I'm sorry for that language, but
Oh, you're
I
fine.
couldn't think of. Yeah, but really, the reason that it started is actually very libertarian. Ever hear of the
Oh
Stonewall
yeah, the
riots?
Stonewall. Yeah, no, no,
Yeah,
no, it's
that's the whole
I agree.
purpose of it. You would think that libertarians would love that. I mean,
I
taking
think
it to
talking about I think talking about the history and talking about just like talk about the history of the civil rights movement and all that. Like I think that's all well and good. I sometimes for me it's more like the all the corporations and whatnot
oh
putting
yeah,
rainbow flags and all
that's
that. Yeah, which is
yeah.
like, and I even have like gay libertarian friends who like agree exactly with. Actually, it's funny. Like back when I was really active with the Mises Caucus, I made a pride flag version of the Mises Caucus logo, and one of my gay Mises Caucus friends said, "I don't like the rainbow stuff, man. Like, you want to talk about the Stonewall riots? Yeah, sure, that's cool, but like, I don't want to get pandered to, and this is all just like, like corporate
Yeah.
propaganda, like, which like, and I kind of agreed with that because that is sort of what like again." I was with like the left during like Occupy, right? And like
Right,
Bernie
right.
Sanders, right? And I literally watched the left go from like eat the rich to being like, oh, corporations are awesome as long as they put a rainbow flag up once a year, right? So
Yeah,
that's
and
kind of what I
only on their American accounts. Don't
right.
go to their Middle East accounts. They won't have them there.
Right,
Um,
exactly. Yeah. It's crazy.
no, but yeah, you're right. What Pride Month has become has just been so. If anything, it's been hijacked, and it's now just a very kind of awful display. I'm cool about being, like I was talking earlier. Be proud of who you are. Um, and if part of who you are is significant, if your sexuality is significant in that, probably not best to do it around kids. Yeah, probably.
I
I
don't
would.
think that's unreasonable, but
I mean, look, man. If you want to have a pride parade down Main Street and you want to dress like whatever fetish you want, cool. Probably don't bring your kids there. Don't have your kids there. It's not a good idea. It's not a good look. And well, it probably has some really negative motives behind it if they did willingly bring their kids to that. But that's a whole other topic of conversation we don't need to get into.
yeah. Well, I made a post, similar to this, I think a couple weeks ago, where I said, like listen, I have my Christian convictions, but I'm happy to respect, and even fight for the liberties of gay people and trans people if the state are infringing upon them. But I think what would help, because like there's this talk often about like a ceasefire in the culture war, especially among libertarians, and
Mm-hmm.
I actually agree with that. But I think what has to happen is that like if you're more in the LGBT crowd, right, you're more of a social progressive, and then for people like me who are more like on the social conservative and the Christian crowds, like we do kind of have to call out and police our own, right? Like I
Yeah,
spend
absolutely.
sometimes an inordinate amount of time blasting Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists on this show. Probably like 90% of my content, to the point where sometimes I feel like it's too much, right? Like I need to not spend every week talking about either Christian nationalists or Israel and Zionism. But it's important because it's like, hey, I'm a Christian. I want Christians to believe in liberty, and I want people to think they can live with Christians in a free society. And when there's Christians saying we need to go around and, put gay people back in the closet and strip them of their rights, or saying that, genocide is good when Israel does it, like that's a problem for me and my philosophy and mission and what I'm doing, right? So, and just like what you
Yeah.
talked about, it's like, like there are, I think there are clearly, if we're being honest, excesses from the LGBT movement where like,
Mm-hmm.
and there are people like Brad Palembo and others out there who I think do a good job of being like, very sane advocates for LGBT rights and advocacy and even
Mm-hmm.
pride, but doing so from a way that like uh lends more credibility and to that idea of a culture war ceasefire that I wish we saw more of.
Yeah, and to your point, I also kind of I was accused recently of going against the right, the economic right, more than I go against the economic left. And I don't think that criticism is unfounded. I do criticize a lot of people who identify more capitalist than I criticize communists. And but the reason behind that is, well, if we're supposed to be aligned, then our messaging should be aligned, and it should be welcoming, and should be tailored for people to, I don't know, get on board and persuade them, um, not using inflammatory type of language, and just because you want to be an edgy person, and go viral off of how despicable of a display you can make on social media. Yeah, I think that we should definitely call that out. And I was kind of, I was chastised for it, because hey, you do this a lot more often than I see you criticize the left. And it's like, well, I mean, I criticizing the left for me is easy, even though,
Right.
in spite of my recent essay, I still hold my tenets and my beliefs. I could criticize them all day. I don't want to. I want to criticize the people that are harming my own, ideology and philosophy.
Right. Well. So this is a perfect tangent to I think the last thing I wanted to talk about, because there's often so another anarchist mantra is that like people will sometimes look down on certain things in society, whether it's sports or entertainment and whatnot, because they'll basically correlate that to being, I don't know where this expression really originates from, but it's the idea that like the bread and the circuses, right? That like the
Mm-hmm.
state is incentivized to kind of like keep people distracted with these things, so they're kind of blind to their own tyranny. And don't get me wrong, there is an element to that which has truth, and you do have to be careful that like like I think there's a reason why I think governments sometimes spend inordinate amount of money on like football and baseball
Yeah.
stadiums and stuff, right? And like Hollywood is definitely not exactly always the pinnacle of culture and art in this day and age, right? So don't get me. It's not that there's a kernel of truth there for sure. But I also think, and we've had conversations about this, that like there are sometimes in I think the reason like sports are really interesting to people is because it's like a real example of like you know people trying to and again, it is sports ball and I know all that, right? But like it's still kind of like acting out like these deeper like humans trying to overcome adversity, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that resonates with people, right? And uh that's why stories sometimes speak to us a lot. Um we were talking the other day about Star Wars and like the different there's like the Jedi code and the Sith code, and we were like talking about how like the Jedi code is so good, but like kind of the they demonize passion, which is wrong because it leads to like this pathology where people repress stuff, and that's kind of like part of the whole arc of Anakin and Vader and all that. And like the Sith code is like, okay, that's really bad, but like there is this part about like passion leading to freedom that like, okay, there's like a hint of something kind of true there, right? And so like stories often like and maybe this is like especially for like I'm a bit of a nerd. I guess you are too to some extent.
Yes. Yeah.
We're like this may be partly us nerding out about stuff, but I also think it's just everyone has something they're nerdy about, right? And for me it's sports and also movies and narratives. And so we had like this argument a while back, and when we were going after each other about the whole like Trump stuff, and we were talking about Lord of the Rings, and you said something to me that was like really impactful, that like really got me to pause and think. Because you were talking about how we shouldn't be Boromir, who thought that he could use the ring for good, and I took that
Yeah.
as like an insult, and I got very defensive. And and then when I kind of like called you out and explained why I was upset, you said like, well, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm not calling you Boromir like as a like that Boromir is like this awful person. He was actually like an honorable man and a good man.
Yeah.
He just didn't understand the extent to which the ring would corrupt him. But then he even after he fell, he overcame his flaws. And I was like, dang, that is true, right? And
Yeah.
like, so that's just an example. Like, there are, uh, so like, as much as I know, like, sure, fiction and entertainment can be distracting, but there's something about fictional narrative and stories that I think that like they resonate us with us for a reason, and I often think that like we should do like again, maybe it only appeals to like one part of the culture and society, right? Like the people who are more like us and nerd out about this stuff, but
Hmm.
I think there's genuinely more room than maybe libertarians realize to do commentary on stories like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, or even like Harry Potter,
Yeah.
Hunger Games, and to kind of be like things that like are in the cultural zeitgeist that people already like, and just kind of like say, hey, you already like this story, and you don't realize the lessons that are emanating out of them are libertarian in essence.
Yeah. No, I mean, seriously, Star Wars is such a libertarian story. Like it's this whole premise. It started over taxation. I
Right.
mean, like our trade routes. My goodness. But no, you're absolutely right. And to your point, I'm currently working on my second book, but it's a novel, and I kind of hope to achieve that very thing. Now, granted, the libertarian themes are much more overt than you're talking, but I do believe that that is such a powerful tool that we can implement. I mean, hell, could you imagine? Just picture this: if the Libertarian Party ever got, this level of funding, just them taking out a Super Bowl ad one time. I mean, what type of impact could that have?
Yeah.
I mean, the tools are there. A lot of the tools that are being used against us can be utilized against the state. Sometimes it's a monetary blockage. Sometimes it's a creative blockage. Sometimes there's just obstacles we can't overcome. But I think that you've got a very valid point, and I think that we should really try and focus on that. I truly do. It really is profound, and I think that more people should try and implement those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's like on one hand, I'm like I've started to think about doing this more, like even with like video games I've played, right? Like I mean, you mentioned Fallout, like there's stuff
Yeah.
there, there's stuff in Skyrim and Elder Scrolls and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I don't know how much of a market there is, but then I figure like, but like my target audience isn't necessarily going to be people who are already libertarians, right? So maybe,
Yeah.
tapping into new markets of people, whether it's about already existing fiction or creating new fiction, right? I think that's very important. Like there is more than one way. Like there are very stereotypical ways to do libertarian activism, right? Doing a
Yeah.
podcast, right?
Yeah.
Political activism. But like not everyone's skill sets are going to be in those very obvious ways, but that doesn't mean that you can't find a way to align things you're passionate about and things that that your skill sets are oriented towards in ways that can, again, it all, it all adds up, right? Like I think people can sometimes feel like you talked about how like we're outnumbered, right? And I like it's so easy to fall down that black pill road. But I always try to encourage people to be like think about like Murray Rothbard however many years ago with just like, like how many libertarians and like anarchists, of our type existed back then. And then, think about it today, how much more it's blown up. And even for all the divisions, it's just like I think there's a lot more to be white pilled about than we'd realize. And that like we're stuck in this very like narrow slice of time. And there's real
Mm-hmm.
problems, and I'm not diminishing them. But I do think, you know, not just because I'm a Christian, but that's part of it too. I do think that what's that expression that like the 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 arrow of history bends towards justice or something like that, or towards liberty. Like
Yeah.
I do think that, and everything you do, it like don't diminish it. Like it is one drop in the bucket of that's eventually going to overflow, I think, right? But
Yeah.
every drop in that bucket's important to some extent because
Yeah.
it culminates over time. We have our big stars in the movement, but even them, like they wouldn't have got there without all of our support. And, like I love when I encounter people who like, in my church or in my workplace or just in life who like, then they'll be like, oh yeah, I caught that. I've seen Michael Malice on this different show, or I've seen Dave Smith or Scott Horton over here, or, I've heard of, I can't think of other libertarian. We don't have tons of famous libertarians, unfortunately. Or Ron Paul, right? There's still people that occasionally be like, "Oh yeah, I remember Ron Paul," and then like you're able to then use that as a springboard, right? So there's this anyway. That's my final word here before we wrap up. Is just that there are so many paths. I think that like as much as there's so many forces of darkness and tyranny working against us, I think there's even more to. I don't know what your position is on the Star Wars sequels. To me, they're a bit of a. But I love that line at like the very last movie where what's his name? I'm forgetting his name. Lando comes in and says, "There's more of us." Right. Yeah. Now, granted, there's not more of us in terms of like libertarians, but I think that like there are actually more ways. Like the free market is superior to the state. Mm-hmm. Like if we actually utilize the free market more, there are more ways to generate liberty than there are to generate tyranny. Mm-hmm. That's what I think.
We could start by making a Star Wars fan film, a fan fiction, where some planet abolishes the Empire's presence and they establish anarchy across the planet. Like, we could do that. Awesome. I don't know the first thing about filmmaking, but
we'll do that, and then we'll make a video game spin-off of it.
Yes, absolutely. It'll be kind of Knights of the Old Republic-esque.
Yes. Derek, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you making the time to come on. I know you're very busy. Tell people where they can find you, if they want to follow you on Twitter or anywhere else they can find things you've published or written before we hop off.
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, thank you again for the invite. I have had such a wonderful time here talking with you, and I thank you for all that you do, because you really are a very great voice in the liberty movement, and we need more people like you. So thank you, seriously. I'm most active on Twitter at AncapAir. I am on Instagram. I don't post a lot. I really don't post. I mainly use Instagram to send reels to my wife. But I am on there.
Said every married man in America.
And it's usually of animals. So it's usually like some giraffe or dogs or something like that. So I'm very boring on Instagram. There's also an AncapAir page on Facebook. I don't remember the last time I posted on it. I mean, you could follow it, but you're not going to get a lot of content out of it. My first book is available on Amazon and Audible. It's called The Liberty Solution. The foreword was written by Walter Block. I'm still proud to say that. I still can't believe it. And working on my second book. Hope to have it finished by the end of this year. And it's a work of fiction, so right on par with our conversation here. So I'm excited for it. And yeah, that's pretty much where you can find me most often. Twitter's the best. I live on Twitter. It's unhealthy, and I probably have a problem.
Same. It is my opiate of choice, I guess you could say. There's more destructive things, I guess, to have a unhealthy addiction to or something. Everyone. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, when Twitter was broken and nobody was getting notifications at all, like, I was like, I need my dopamine. Like, what is happening?
Refresh. Where is it? Oh, I know what you mean. Derek, this has been a blast. Definitely have you back on again sometime, especially when the second book comes out. I'll be excited to read it, maybe have you on to talk about it. Everyone go follow him on X if you're on there, and if you're not on X, go there, because that's where all the action is. You can, of course, follow me on X as well, at Biblical Anarchy. Please make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, wherever you're watching, or if you're listening to the audio later. Again, 5-star reviews are a great help. And again, we'll be here again Thursday night at 6:30 with Stephen Nikela of the Libertarian Party. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys for tonight. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace and live for Christ. Take care.